have with us this afternoon, I esteem Professor Benon Basheka, who will be taking us through the research topic, negotiating access and research ethics and critical issues which are pertaining to postgraduate students, particularly to those that are in supply chain management. We are indeed privileged to have with us Professor Basheka, who is the first Deputy Vice Chancellor for Academic Affairs at the Kabela University in Uganda. He is also the CEO and Managing Director of Radix Management Consultant with vast experience. Those of us that are in procurement and supply chain management would indeed be privileged to listen to him today. He has written a lot of publications, books, articles, and of course, with his insights, we would be able to take a lot out of this presentation. I will then give the floor to our esteemed Professor Basheka. Thank you very much. He will carry on with the presentation, and after he's done, we'll then engage with him. And colleagues will appreciate if you can just keep to the house rule and make sure that your mic is muted. Thank you very much, Professor Basheka. Over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Professor Ambe and colleagues. Those who have joined in the webinar, you are all welcome. I will be making a presentation on negotiating access and research ethics, as the chair has mentioned. And you must appreciate that negotiating access is almost in the middle of the research process when you are doing your postgraduate program. So I have to connect that negotiating access with the rest of the research processes, possibly which you may have gone through. Whereas I appreciate that this webinar is specifically for supply chain management students, research processes are almost the same, irrespective of the discipline one is undertaking. Once you join a postgraduate class, depending on whether you are doing a postgraduate class where you are starting with research only, or whether you are doing coursework first. If you do coursework first, you are introduced to the theories in various modules. But when you are doing a postgraduate program by research, you are basically introduced to the research processes. The starting point being that you are told to identify a topic yourself as a graduate student. And unlike undergraduate students, where we set the questions and you are supposed to answer those questions, for postgraduate classes, you set the question yourself in terms of selecting the topic, and you are supposed to answer that by walking yourself and possibly your supervisor through the entire research process. And one of the primary outputs is the research proposal. But before you write the research proposal, you have, of course, read through the institutional guidelines and procedures where they will tell you the do's and the don'ts. And one of the aspects is the ethical considerations. Researchers, irrespective of the discipline, have to undertake literature review, both primary and secondary literature review. And the magnitude of that exercise will determine what problem you are going to research on, because you may find what you initially had an idea as the research topic within supply chain or in other field. You find, as you review the literature, you may find others have already done research around that same area, and the problem which you had may have been solved. Now, assuming you have done the literature review comprehensively, you have eventually zeroed on your research area, and you have selected the problem you want to investigate, and you have done comprehensive literature review. You are now, you have selected your design, then a question comes where you need to access data for your research, or you need to access the respondents, and that's where negotiating access comes in. And research ethics, certainly, as I reemphasize, cuts across the entire research process. Once you have been granted access, then you engage yourself in all the data collection processes, depending on, again, on the type of research you are doing, whether you are doing qualitative research or whether you are doing quantitative research. The magnitude of data you are going to collect will inform the scheme which you are going to use to analyze that data. And once you analyze the data, of course, in relation with the problem you are investigating, in relation with the objectives or the questions you are trying to answer, then once you have organized yourself, you start writing a dissertation or a thesis, depending on which level, because some are at the master's level, others at the doctoral level. Then once you have finished your dissertation and the supervisor or supervisors have endorsed, you start preparing yourself for a number of institutional procedures, whether, for example, you have registered as required, whether you have paid the fees required, whether you have fulfilled all the institutional requirements, which may also include subjecting your work to some editing, some review, some plagiarism checks, and so on. Then you go through the whole process of examination. You submit your dissertation or thesis, which has to be, again, walked through the institutional processes. They identify for you an external examiner as well as internal examiners, depending on which university you are in. Then once the processes of examinations are over, the administrative processes, they call you for a viva voce interface. Some universities do not have viva voce examination. Once they have received the external examiner's report and it is positive, then there are a few processes you have to go through without necessarily going through a viva. And that is mainly the American model, where they rarely do viva voce examinations. And once you have completed all those programs, you have to go for graduation ceremony. And once you have graduated, either you walk away with your academic documents or you come back within the university to collect your academic documents. So all these processes are almost universal for a doctoral student. Now, in the second slide, I emphasize supply chain management research, because supply chain is generally concerned with how things get to where they are supposed to be or where we find them. And because supply chain management has its primary objectives of minimizing shortages and keeping costs to the minimum, also minimizing the work in progress, supply chain being concerned with, among others, reducing transportation costs, as well as increasing the distribution channel of the products, depending on the nature of the product you are dealing with, providing services and making plans and strategies to maximize productivity, as well as increasing customer satisfaction. That tells us that we have a wide range of areas where we can select our topics for supply chain research. And one of the sometimes difficult questions for graduate students is how do you select a topic? How do you select an area of research? In this case, concerning ourselves with supply chain, there are a number of factors that should guide a graduate student in selecting the topic of research. Of course, the first factor is the interest. We say, as a graduate student, you must select a topic in supply chain management, for this case, where you have an interest. Whether, for example, you want to focus your research on the downstream activities of the supply chain, or on the upstream activities of the supply chain, and the decision, or in the middle part, and the decision you make will eventually also heavily influence the type of theories you are going to use, because supply chain management is a bit multidisciplinary. It borrows from a number of other disciplines. So depending on the area you are going to focus your research, then you are guided on what theory you are going to use. And because graduate research is normally a bit a lonely exercise, especially more so at a doctoral level, you are in books all the time. Even you have to forget about your social activities. If you choose an area where which is not interesting, then that loneliness is likely to cause some boredom and stress. So choose an area where you definitely have an interest. But not only do you focus on an area where you have an interest as a graduate student, but the supervisor also must have interest in that area. It helps when both of you have the interest. The second factor that you need to consider is your career progression. Ask yourself, you are here in 2020, in the next 10 years, where do you want to be? Where do you want to build your career? And once you have answered that question, then you choose a topic which is closely linked to the career you want to build, and you'll find it extremely useful if your research fits within your career which you are trying to project. The other factor that you certainly need to consider when you are choosing a postgraduate research area of research, an area of research, is the time you have. Remember, when you are a doctoral student, for example, you are within the university for 3 years. When you are doing a master's degree, you may be within the university for only 1 year or 2 years. And the university or the college where you are operating normally has a limitation on what time you are going to spend within the university and how you are going to complete your study. So depending on the time that you have and depending on the type of degree you are doing, research-based degree or a degree based on both research and coursework, it will determine the depth of your research focus. And the more you go deeper, remember, the more difficult the research tends to be. And depending on the scope you select, the more tiring the research process is going to be. So we recommend that you only do research in a specific area where you are going to contribute knowledge. You don't have to do research in the entire supply chain processes, and you only move around on top without going into depth. The factor of budget, because research is a costly exercise, right from for example, accessing the materials when you are not within the university setup. Remember, you must have internet 24 hours almost. You need to require printing services. You require services for editors. You require people who transcribe your data. If you are doing, for example, qualitative research, there are experts who have to be involved as far as transcribing that data is concerned. If you are doing quantitative research in supply chain, data analysis is also a cost you have to consider. Although these days we encourage all postgraduate students should be able to analyze their own data because that is part of their contribution. But as you are choosing the area to focus on, find out whether you have the adequate resources which will walk you through that entire research process. The other factor that you will consider when you are choosing a research topic is the practical use of the data. Because there are so many graduate students, there are so many areas where they can research, but ask yourself whether you can select a research within supply chain, which can make useful contribution in the practical aspects. If you want to study to elevate your career, then you should consider choosing an area where your study will make a contribution, will make a difference. Because as you review the literature, you'll find several people have done research around that area, but ask yourself, what is your contribution? And that goes to the idea of also considering novelty. Select a research which is unique in the sense that not everybody has done research in that area. That's when you can make a useful contribution within knowledge. And the other factor is the ease of access. And that's where the aspect of negotiating access comes in. Because you are going to require respondents to answer your questions or to interview, or you are going to require documents to review for purposes of secondary information, then you must choose a research where you know you are going to access. There are some areas where automatically you will know from inception that you will not have access to those areas, either because of the confidentiality requirements. For example, even if you want to do research in the supply chain area, which involves, for example, the cabinet ministers, you know accessing cabinet minutes in most countries is prohibited. If you want to do research in supply chain and logistics within the military, you must know that from the beginning that the military tends to have what they call classified information. And therefore, it will be very difficult for you to access certain areas because of a number of factors. So if your research generally is extremely sensitive, then your data collection processes could take a lot of time because negotiating access will in itself be extremely difficult. Now, practically, when we go to negotiating access within the research context, you must appreciate that business research and supply chain management research tends to involve mostly human beings. And that brings you to understanding the unit of analysis. As a graduate student, you must from inception understand your unit of analysis, which has to be differentiated from your unit of observation. Is your research, for example, on individuals within the supply chain? Is it on the groups within the supply chain? Is your research on the organization at an organization level? Is it at a government level? Is it society-wide? Once you have determined that, then issues of ethics also come in, particularly when you are dealing with human beings, because it relates to interface. Generally, across the globe, most universities have established guidelines for conducting postgraduate research. And one of the areas that they emphasize is the ethical consideration. What should you consider as you are undertaking the postgraduate research? And in the context of our debate, access to research can be at different levels. The first level, we deal with the traditional access, where you physically go and interface with the respondents. But these days, because of technology, we are talking about internet-mediated access. You may not necessarily physically meet the respondents you are interested in. You can send an online questionnaire where you expect them to fill in. Once you have obtained their emails, or you can have a telephone conversation without necessarily meeting the person. And access can also be contextualized to involve the internal researchers or external researchers. Increasingly, you'll find that most postgraduate students do their work while they are also undertaking research. And if you are in an organization X and you are undertaking maybe a master's degree, an MBA in supply chain management, or a PhD in supply chain management, and you are in a logistics-related organization, most graduate students are tempted to do research within their own organizations. Now, those are the ones I'm calling internal researchers, because you have insider information, you know the people inside the organization very well, and therefore you may assume that you can easily access the information. But there are also ethical issues. Even if you are an internal person, even if you are a CEO, for example, you cannot do research within your own organization before you have obtained permission from the relevant authorities. So both of these types of access have ethical issues and guidelines which need to be followed. Now, within traditional research, which involves face-to-face interactions, for example, where you are conducting experiments, or this face-to-face may involve when you are conducting interviews, maybe on customer satisfaction within the supply chain, or you are undertaking focus group discussions or observations, or you want to administer questionnaires about the topic you are investigating. You must know that negotiating access is a process, and how you enter the physical access or entry is usually determined by the initial contacts, whom the literature calls the gatekeepers. The gatekeeper may not literally mean the gatekeeper you find at the entrance, but the first person as you enter an organization where you are seeking access, they tend to build a certain image, and that image can either be positive or negative, and it will lead you to access. For example, if they perceive the value you are going to add to the organization, if they perceive that you are going to ensure confidentiality of the information you need, if you convince them that you are a credible researcher, you are a credible postgraduate student, and you are only looking for information for that purpose, and if they don't have any doubts about your capabilities, then the most probable chance is that they will give you access. But remember, as you start negotiating access, there are two alternatives. Either they may accept your access to information without any conditions, or there are three actual options. They may accept without conditions, or they may accept with conditions, or access may be denied. Accepting with conditions, they will say, okay, yes, we are going to give you the data, but they will allocate you a room where all the files you want will be, for example, placed, and you are only supposed to review the information, the documents from that office without necessarily taking anything out. And this is mostly common in the companies which are profit-oriented. Those supply chain-oriented companies which are profit-oriented, they may fear that their information may be shared with the competitors, so they tend to put those restrictions. To the extent even some of them will not allow you to go with a smartphone, because they know you can easily use that smartphone to share the information. There are important issues you need to appreciate and note as you engage in the process of negotiating access. One of them being the obvious one, that negotiating access is a process which is continuous, and it is not a one event. Of course, some postgraduate students, because of their networks, their parents, their relatives, their friends may be in the organization, and therefore they may have easy access to some information. But overall, access is a process. You may try today, you fail. Tomorrow you try, you fail. And when you go on the third day, you find you have succeeded. Then you must also note that physical access can only be granted through the hierarchy of the organization. Some organizations have strict rules and regulations that unless the CEO has given a letter authorizing you to access the organization, then you cannot access the organization or any information. And normally that communication can be circulated to the members of the organization granting you access. You also must appreciate that gaining the confidence and the trust of the intended participants within the organization is very critical, because they are the ones who will give you the information. And right from the time when you are selecting a topic for postgraduate research, start thinking about access, because don't select a supply chain research where you know you are not going to get access to the information you require. And everything therefore requires a lot of planning. You have to plan ahead of your formal request for access, prepare yourself psychologically, prepare the resources that you need, and all the logistics which are required. And sometimes you also must appreciate that there may be trade-offs. These days it is common in a number of countries where postgraduate students face a challenge, that you want to go and interact with the respondents, then they will ask you maybe money to facilitate their transport, or the drinks and so on. So depending on what type of research you are doing within supply chain management, these days the NGO world has tended to commercialize most of those engagements. So you must be prepared that there may be trade-offs which are necessary. And when you are given access, goodwill from the organization and its members, don't take it for granted. And therefore, you should be able to demonstrate your competence and integrity. And the person who gave you entry should be remembered, and make sure you keep the credibility, the trust that the individual put in you by negotiating your access. When you are an internal researcher and you want to gain access within the organization, still, even if you are a CEO, you have to gain access possibly from from the oversight organ, because you may display information in your research which may be considered detrimental, and you may end up losing a job. If you are a junior staff, then you know the reporting hierarchy, how to write and ensure you get the required approvals. Irrespective of your status within the organization, you must get access. But sometimes when we are in organizations where we want to do research, people already have an image of whom we are. Either you may be so close to the boss, and when you are asking a particular information, some people may say you are maybe looking it for spying purposes, or some may develop some level of bias against you. So depending on the status you have, depending on the culture you have constructed within the organization, it determines the level of access, even if you are an internal person. And always try to maintain your integrity and objectivity. Because for postgraduate students who do research within their own organizations where they work, one of the challenges they tend to have is the failure to separate themselves from the research process. And one way of maintaining objectivity is to ensure that the information which you know is what you know, but when you are a researcher, behave as a researcher, not as a staff within the organization. There you'll be able to maintain objectivity and guard against bias. Of course, you have to be friendly and courteous to the people you will be dealing with in the organization, irrespective of the level. And without emphasizing it, the way you enter an organization determines whether you are going to be allowed access. Supply chain professionals, there has not been really much debate about the dress code, but for us when I'm doing consultancy, I cannot enter a client's organization without putting on a suit or a tie, because that image will determine whether I get what I want, or the perception, building the perception. When I'm going to make a presentation, a report, a consultancy report to the client, the way I present myself will determine the confidence the client is going to build in me, and the credibility of the information which I will be presenting. So if you are an internal researcher, make sure you demonstrate that kind of level. Now, for internet-based research, whether qualitative or quantitative, increasingly we are trying to use internet to collect data, and therefore it is important that you negotiate initial access on a personal basis if it is for organizations. How, for example, are you going to access the emails for the respondents you are targeting? Even if it is a virtual access, it can be negotiated where you know the respondents. It could be members within your same class. If you are a postgraduate class, usually postgraduate students tend to have networks that they can help you to actually access a certain organization where you have a difficulty. But where you go with the view that you'll get. I experienced this some time back, I think about more than 10 years. I was supervising a master's student at Uganda Management Institute then, who was a minister in the government, but she had a belief that for her, she could be able to access the information using a fellow cabinet minister. And when they went to, I think, an MTN company, they told them, you have to write, and then we have to be able to negotiate, to discuss as a board, and we'll grant you access, because they were not sure whether this minister was actually using that information for postgraduate research or whether she was going to use it for some other purposes. And once they have given you access, remember there are data protection laws for internet access information. There are data privacy laws that must be protected, and do not use the data beyond the purpose, which is graduate research. So there are a whole range of techniques and strategies which you can use to gain access. In addition to what I have mentioned, ensure you are familiar with the organizational group before you initiate contact. And here, this is where network theory can be helpful. Allow yourself sufficient time to make sure you plan on how you are going to access the data. Make sure you use existing contacts and develop new ones. Never underrate the people you have in class. Never underrate the capacity of your supervisors or your academic, the teaching staff. Where you may have a challenge, some of them may be able to help you and provide a clear account of your research purpose. Why do you need the information you are seeking from the organization before they can grant you access? Depending on how you convince them, and being proactive to address any concerns, because some of them will ask you some questions, or they will say, make some commitments before you access the information. So you should be able to address those concerns such that you build their confidence. And the other strategy is, as much as possible, if you are doing a supply chain research, show them what they will benefit if they gave you the information. You did your research, you produced the results, show them what benefits they may get if they have granted you access to the information. Of course, use appropriate language where once you go there, you build rapport, engage with some staff. Remember, some staff within the organization, even at the junior level, they may have strong contacts with the supervisors, and they can easily give you access to information. Then when they ask you any question, make sure you facilitate the reply, either if they have called you or if they have asked you a question which you cannot answer there and then, make sure you promise that you will call back, and indeed make sure you do it and make a follow-up. Like I mentioned earlier on, gaining access is incremental. It is not a one-time event. Of course, for some graduate students, they can easily access on a first entry. But in most cases, you first make a first entry, then you got the second entry, you are negotiating. You got the third entry, they are negotiating. And before, in some cases, you may go 4 or 5 times before they can allow you. Once you have been allowed, remember, maintain your credibility and assure the organization or the respondents that the information you are seeking is purely for academic purposes and it will be, confidentiality will be maintained. And of course, maintain professional conduct. You don't go there and start demonstrating your bad manners. Some graduate students may have poor social upbringing, and then when you are in an organization, your conduct is questioned. Make sure as much as possible you avoid that. The second part of this presentation was about research ethics, and the ethics are the do's and the don'ts. We use ethics to generally mean the standards of behavior that should guide you when you are conducting research within the people, within the respondents, or the subject you are carrying on. And these ethics can relate to the individuals, to the groups, or the researcher versus the respondents' ethical issues. It can be ethics in terms of the scientific discipline. Supply chain management may have its own guidelines on how the research should be conducted. Ethics tends to relate to the codes of conduct, the codes of behavior on what you should do and what you should not do. And it enters into more or less the malpractices or the harm, especially when you are dealing with respondents. You should never subject them to any harm. And because of most institutions have developed the institutional guidelines on the do's and the don'ts for research. As a postgraduate student, you must make sure you take care that your conduct as the researcher and how you design the entire research from the beginning up to the end. Don't, for example, select a topic which you know another person is doing and you only make some minor changes. That is unethical. If you cite someone, don't use the words as if they are yours when you should have made a referencing citation. That is also unethical. Don't choose respondents who have not accepted. If you are going for an interview, do not start recording the respondents before they have actually accepted you. Now, the harm you may inflict on the people, on the respondents, on your subjects, or on the profession may be more dangerous. And therefore, you should regard ethics to be across the entire research process. We have ethical issues when you are selecting the study problem. Like I mentioned earlier on, do not select a problem for the sake that you have easy access to information. Research is supposed to involve a high degree of rigor, a high degree of seriousness. Therefore, don't choose a study problem where you know automatically you'll find it easy to undertake the research. There are ethics in literature review, either misquoting someone or using, like I mentioned, someone's words as if they are yours when actually they are not. Consider ethics when you are choosing the research design. It is unethical to have a problem you are investigating and then you choose a completely divergent research design which does not tally with the problem which you are investigating. Ethics also tends to come in as we are doing the sampling. Most graduate students tend to choose a sample which is convenient for them, and yet whether you are doing qualitative or quantitative research, there are sampling strategies which you must apply, and each of them has the rules and guidelines that should be followed. Ethics can come in when you are choosing data collection methods. You may choose a wrong data collection method given the subject you are investigating within supply chain. In data collection, there are so many ethical issues. Like I mentioned, the issue of confidentiality, the issue of access, where you have gone in someone's organization and before they have given you access, you find you are in the office, and that may be construed to be unethical. In data analysis, there are so many unethical issues by graduate students where you choose a wrong data analysis technique because each of the data analysis techniques has its rules and regulations. There are classical assumptions which must be obeyed when you are choosing the data analysis technique. If you are doing, if you want to run a correlation coefficient, there are two types. Does your questionnaire and do your data obey the rules of correlation analysis? If you want to go to do factor analysis, do you obey the rules of factor analysis as recommended within the literature? As you do the reporting, certainly, as well as when you start disseminating the information, there are still a number of ethical issues. So that's why in that diagram which follows, there are so many ways of considering ethics. Different people consider ethics differently, but the issues of integrity, when you are talking about ethics, integrity comes in, respect is another variable which comes in, rules and regulations are other dimensions which will come in the equation, the justice, doing what you would want others to do for you, dignity, issues of confidentiality, all these elements in this cycle constitute what generally we call the research ethics. There is one of them which is autonomy. As a researcher, you must also have your own, you must have your independence and autonomy to make sure you stand by what you have researched. I have witnessed some graduate students, when you have written something and you go to your supervisor, the supervisor says, makes a question, then you simply say, no, I'm going to change without defending your viewpoint. A postgraduate student, you are supposed to stand by your opinion as long as you are sure you have thoroughly researched, you have read the literature, and you have an intellectual grounding in the argument you are advancing. Then you should be able to stand by it, and that goes into the aspect of autonomy. The ethical principles generally in the supply chain research or any other research, one of them is integrity and objectivity. As much as possible, while there is a debate between qualitative research and the qualitative and quantitative research, one of the differences being that the quantitative research is objective and the qualitative research is subjective. Even qualitative researchers now have reached a consensus that every research is supposed to be objective as opposed to subjectivity. And that means that you should be openly telling the truth, and you should be as accurate as possible, and as much as possible in this respect, avoid misrepresentation of data and findings. Do not push the data to what exactly you want. Do not interpret the statistics because that's how you want it. If you have started with a hypothesis, but then you collect the data and you find that the data is not supporting the hypothesis, do not change it. After all, when you start with a hypothesis and later on you find the data is not agreeing with it, still you are making a useful contribution as a postgraduate student. The second ethical principle generally is respect for others. And this, as a researcher, you should be able to know that, yes, you are only doing that, but others have done it before. And therefore, your role as a supply chain researcher should be based on the development of trust and respect for others, respect the discipline where you are investigating, respect the community and the rights of others. It could be persons, it could be groups, should be recognized as you do the research. The other ethical principle is to avoid harm, because any harm that you are going to inflict, for example, on the participants can be disastrous to your, and will affect the quality of your research. And harm can be physical, or it can be pain, psychological pain. You may cause discomfort when you are doing research, or you may cause embarrassment or anxiety or stress or conflict. And therefore, all that should be avoided as one way of promoting ethics. Then the privacy of the participants should be maintained. That's why when you are designing your questionnaire in the background characteristics, sometimes before you start conducting an interview, you ask the respondents whether they would want their identity to be disclosed. If they say they don't want their identity to be disclosed, then certainly you should make sure you respect their privacy and confidentiality. Seek their consent before you engage them, and make sure you are highly responsible in data analysis to make sure you have accuracy in the reporting of the results. Some areas require compliance with the laws of the countries. Some areas require compliance with the laws and regulations or policies of the institution where you are doing research on how data should be managed. Make sure you comply with those ones as a way of promoting ethical practices. Then you must ensure the safety of the researcher himself or herself as part of the ethical guidelines. Now, when you are doing internet-mediated research, still there are ethical principles which have to be involved. There are both the issues and dilemmas which are associated, for example, with the use of blogs, the bulletin boards or chat rooms. The chair started by giving the rules of this webinar today, and those were the ethical guidelines. So if the chair said all the participants should mute their microphones, that is an ethical process which must be respected. Within internet-mediated research, the scope of deception sometimes can be high, and therefore avoid that, where you send a questionnaire to some respondents and you may use an email which is deceptive or which is not yours, but you are pretending as if you are the one. That should be avoided. Also practice respect and avoid causing harm, ensure confidentiality of the data and the anonymity of the respondents, the copyright issues as well as the safety of the researchers must be considered. Of course, I touched on this one, data protection and management. These days, because of the internet laws, in the law schools, they have what they call computer and the law. Now, in the computer and the law, one of the primary concerns is how they should keep the data and how long the data should be kept. So all primary data should be securely kept. Some organizations have regulations on how long they can be kept. Make sure, as far as data protection and management is concerned, use the data only for the purpose intended, and keep it for not necessarily for a long period beyond what it is used for. Mr. Chairman and members, in a conclusion, in terms of my final remarks, irrespective again of whether you are doing supply chain research, whether you are doing procurement specific research, whether you are doing research on logistics, whether you are doing research on accounting or on sociology, you must appreciate that research is a process, and that process involves, on one spectrum, there is a researcher, and then on the other end, there are research subjects. As a researcher, you have your expectations. The other subjects also have their expectations, and there must be rules of engagement. Now, scientific research, as we know it from the word science, means relying on the standard rules and procedures, which others would respect, that you are involved in objectivity, the level of rigor, which is seriousness, the level of accuracy. As you are doing supply chain research or another research, emphasize the scientific principles. Avoid the common man way of doing research, but behave like a scientist. And the scientists have a certain way of how they do their things. Graduate students are expected to do original research, and that research is supposed to contribute to knowledge. Contributing knowledge in a doctoral viva voce examinations, that is one of the widely asked questions. Although some have taken it for granted that you must ask a question, what is the originality? But how do you measure originality? That debate, the literature sorts it out. but generally graduate research, students are expected to do original research that contributes to knowledge. Science is knowledge. And if you are to contribute to knowledge, and if you are to do research which is really rigorous and meets the scientific parameters, then accessing the required information is also critical for that venture. And that's why you must consider all these strategies we have shared. And access still remains your main, even if you access the information, make sure you maintain the obligations of the respondents and the rules of the engagement. While technology and the use of the internet has revolutionized the research, it has created opportunities for research, but it has also created challenges almost in equal measure. So as a graduate student, you should be able to balance these two. One of the opportunities which internet has brought for graduate students is easier access to materials. But the other danger it has brought is plagiarism, the cut and paste syndrome, because Professor Ambe may have done research within the South African context, and you are in Uganda, you may assume that no one is going to know you. You pick the research which was done in South Africa, and you do it in Uganda. Once that information is uploaded on the website, they will be able to access it. So make sure you avoid plagiarism, and as a graduate student, always follow the institutional rules and regulations as stipulated normally in what they call graduate handbooks. They specify the rules and regulations which you must follow. And being from one institution, you may have studied your master's in one institution and then you go to do your doctoral program in another institution. Certainly no, those institutions are different. All of them may have their own institutional rules. And finally, remember, whatever we are doing, supply chain management is a profession. And as a profession, we are trying to maintain the professional standards. And where there are existing bodies that have issued professional guidelines and standards, those ones always need to be respected. Mr.